Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hurtig, Artistic Director, and I'm very happy to share this conversation from our archive featuring Colson Whitehead and Yaa Gyasi in conversation with John Freeman. This event was recorded live on October 20th, 2016 as part of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This event features acclaimed novelist Colson Whitehead discussing his novel, The Underground Railroad, and debut author Yaa Gyasi with her novel, Homegoing.
So tonight's event is called the Chimes of Freedom. And I think maybe a twig snapped in the night. Maybe there was a change of wind. And maybe you woke to a fire. Maybe your house was on fire, so maybe you were running. Maybe you climbed a tree in the night, and you were a child, so you're good at that. Maybe you were knocked down from the tree by a rock, and you woke, and maybe there was 20 or 30 of you in a room. Maybe you were in a dungeon stacked like logs. And maybe you were there for days. Maybe it was a week. Maybe it was a month. Maybe only 5 of you survived. Maybe you never saw your parents again. Maybe you were on a boat for weeks. Maybe it was a month. Maybe you were pushed overboard and survived. Maybe you saw someone tied to a chair who did not. Maybe you were forced to breed like animals. Maybe you escaped by running. Maybe you were re-enslaved for not crossing the street because a white woman was approaching you. Maybe your enslavement is the perfect expression of an economic system that takes the labor of many and puts it into the hands of a few. Maybe the fruits of your labor are evident in all the capital cities of the world. Maybe it's just because numbers are not enough. 12.5 million stolen and shipped to the U.S. alone, an entire city of New York, 10.7 million of whom survived. Maybe this is a story beyond empathy, as in a story we need to keep telling because of its impossibility. Maybe storytelling is history, as in maybe this is why 2 of the best novels published in the United States this year, 150 years after the end of the slave trade has ended, deal with the sordid history of slavery. And maybe that's why Yaa Gyasi and Colson Whitehead wrote them. All of the details I just read to you came from their books. Homecoming, Gyasi's epic first novel about 2 sisters, Essie and Effia, and their family lines which bend and crisscrossing the developing slave trade in what is now Ghana. And The Underground Railroad, Colson Whitehead's #1 New York Times bestselling 6th novel, the story of a man and a woman's heroic escape from the inconceivably brutal bonds of slavery in the Deep South aboard the storied network that some suggest allowed as many as 100,000 lucky souls escape to slavery. They're here with us now. Yaa Gyasi was born in Ghana and raised in Huntsville, Alabama, and graduated from Stanford University. She's also a very recent graduate I just discovered, of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she held a Dean's Graduate Research Fellowship. Her short stories have appeared in African American Review and Callaloo, and Homecoming is her debut novel, which will be published in more than 21 countries. Colson Whitehead grew up in New York and graduated from Harvard University. He's a former staff writer of The Village Voice, so he will be excellent on pop culture. But he is also the author of 5 other novels, including Intuitionist, which was a winner of the PEN/Hemingway Award, and John Henry Days, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and Zone 1. Zone 2 is coming, I hope. Zone 1 was a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of 2 works of nonfiction, including The Colossus of New York, one of the best books I think ever written about New York City, and a fantastic book about gambling and second chances. He is a winner of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and his recent book, which she is here to talk about tonight. The Underground Railroad was selected by Oprah for her book club. Please join me in welcoming them, Yaa Gyasi and Colson Whitehead. It's such a pleasure to be here with you two. We're going to talk for a bit, and each of them are going to read at some point, and then I'm going to take questions for you. But just to start us off, Colson and longing plays an enormous part of both of your books. Longing for family. Colson, Cora, one of your two main characters, only has memories of her mother, and it's certainly the case in your book that people are constantly being separated from those they love. I wonder if you could talk about just how that force of longing drives people through the many generations that your book covers.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about a lot while writing Homegoing was the fact that these families that are impacted by slavery were ripped apart in these inconceivable, often irreparable ways. How you have so many groups, so many people who can't trace their family back beyond their grandparents, beyond their great-grandparents, and that distance, I guess, from your family members, I think is something that you live with, that carries on with you. And so that was something I was thinking about quite a bit, and hoping that this book was kind of a way of connecting this family for people who didn't get a chance to see it all together.
Yeah, each chapter of your book is a different generation of the family, and you kind of follow these two twin family tracks. Each chapter is a different family track. And I wonder if you can talk about just the way that absence is inherited down the family line, if you will.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the things that I was thinking about when working on Homegoing was the idea that you can inherit things that aren't physical, Obviously, when we think about inheritances, we think about, land or money or these physical traits, this way you smile can be something that your mother had. But I wondered if there were things that people inherit that had nothing to do with physicality. If you could inherit a memory, if you could inherit like a way of being. And so that was something that was pretty heavily on my mind.
Colson, do you want to talk about this in terms of Cora and how she sort of proceeds from loss and how she tries to obviously she's trying to escape for safety, but she also has a gap to fill.
Sure. Cora is well, let me start by thanking all you nice folks for coming out and for the festival, for having us. I haven't met Yaa before. Very honored. And John, I know. And
not honored.
And there's John. Cora is my protagonist. Is a teenager. She's not sure how old she is. She could be 17 or 18. Slave masters didn't keep track of their property's ages in the same way you might have a dog named Fido, but not know if he was born on April 18th or April 20th. Or what year. No one knows how old she is because you don't keep track of how old your tools are. And her mother has escaped a couple years before, run north. And so in the parlance of the plantation, she's a stray, like a stray dog, and with no one to look after her. And so a lot of this, once she actually finally gets the courage up to leave, part of what she's chasing after is, one, her mother, the sort of shadow figure who abandoned her, and also an imagined home that she might be able to find for herself. Of course, when you're escaping from a terrible situation, whether you're a slave or an immigrant coming to a new place, you're looking for a new place, a new family, a new home to make, and and that's what she sees in Massachusetts or New York or Canada, a place of new beginnings and a new sort of family life.
Yeah, I wonder if both of you can talk, maybe Colson, you can answer this first, about the challenges of, Colson, this is your 6th novel, but this is probably the first novel you've written where your character doesn't have free will necessarily. And what are the challenges of telling a story about a character who has that in a sort of theoretical sense, but in an actual practical sense does not really have that?
Sure. I mean, all your protagonists have different problems and challenges in trying to animate them on the page. In the case of Cora, I'm taking someone who is uneducated, whose only world has been the plantation and knows nothing outside of it. And so as she goes from state to state, going more and more north in these different episodes, hopefully I'm bringing in a supporting cast and different kinds of tableaus where she can expand her notion of what the world is, what freedom is, and who she is. And so I'm not sure if you know about the sort of the conceit of the book, one of the conceits, I guess. But each state that she goes through as she goes north is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels. So South Carolina has its own sort of culture and way of doing things, and then North Carolina and et cetera. And so the book is sort of rebooting every 60 pages. And by straying from the historical record, I'm allowed to have a sort of larger conversation about history and race. And then hopefully all these different sort of places I bring Cora to give her really good stages or arenas for her to figure out what freedom means as she gets further north and who she is.
Yeah, and your book, sort of hopscotches forward through history. There's the independence movement in Ghana, and people discuss Kwame Nkrumah, and in the United States, there's President Taylor. There's the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. They wind up in Harlem at one point, sort of during the jazzing era and onward. And I wonder if with each different historical section, if you were saying something in your mind different about that passage of history, or if that was more just context in which to sort of develop your character.
I mean, a little bit of both. So I kind of started this book because I really wanted to talk about the legacy of slavery. I kind of wanted to talk about what we have been left with, particularly in America and in Ghana. And so that long timeline was so important to me. And I kind of wanted to be able to track the ways in which things have or maybe have not changed that much. And so I felt like each new chapter, each new character allowed me an opportunity to kind of think about, the things that these characters would have been going through and how that related to their ancestors and the things that their ancestors had gone through and kind of what the political climate of the time their ancestors were living in, how that affected their own lives. And so when I wrote this, I actually wrote with an outline, not really an outline, but a family tree that I put above the wall. And it had, just the character's name and also one thing that was happening kind of politically during the time period that they would have lived in. And that's kind of how I approached each chapter, was thinking about what it would mean to have your family kind of swallowed back up into slavery after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, or to be dealing with the Asantwa War. So that's kind of what I was thinking about, is the way these things kind of accumulate over time.
The one descendant of one of the two sisters, this is simply called H. Mm-hmm. And he ends up working in coal mines, and as a freed person, but then who is then re-enslaved by breaking the law, basically. Right. And he becomes an indentured slave, I guess is the term. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So he's a convict, essentially, who's kind of taken back into this form of slavery that was convict leasing. And I kind of came to that character just thinking about the era after Reconstruction, and there are a lot of jobs that we do think of. Sharecropping is one, but I stumbled upon Douglas Blackman's Washington Post article that he talked about the convict leasing system in, and I was so astonished by the fact that I knew so little about this. Even having grown up in Alabama, it was something that we were never really taught in schools, and it just brought home again that devastation, the kind of relentlessness of this system. Even when you think you're out, you're not really out. They can pull you right back in a second.
Colson, your book is quite violent, but not ever excessively so, and yet still I wonder if there were ever details that you left out of Cora's travel north, that simply because they would have overwhelmed the narrative and what they were and maybe why you left them out.
Sure. Actually, everything I thought of went in. I didn't leave a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. This one, I know previous books have a file that's like clippings. I'm like, maybe I can recycle that simile sometime, and I never open it again once the book is done. As I did research, I realized and had a more adult reckoning with the brutality of slavery. I realized I was going to, just in order to be realistic, have to have really terrible things happen to Cora and all the supporting cast, especially in Georgia, which is the most realistic chapter before I start playing with reality. And it was difficult. I mean, I don't generally do that sort of stuff with my characters. And then, obviously, I have trouble thinking about it, conceiving it. Is just a shadow of people actually endured it. And so I'm thinking about my nameless great-great-great-great-grandparents who died, and I have no idea where. Was it Alabama? Was it Georgia, Florida? That part of my history is disappeared into the maw of slavery. So I felt a duty to be realistic, to honor my ancestors and, the other slave dead. And I would, sometimes I would put something on the page and wonder if I was being too over the top or too crazy. And then I would just go back to my research and realize that no, I was actually being accurate. I worked on the book for a year and thought about it for a year. And what I can come up with is nothing compared to what a slave master who watched his father beat, rape, and torture slaves. My year is nothing compared to the decades they would spend thinking up gruesome and insane, sadistic punishments to keep the slavery system alive. And so whatever I put in the page was outdone by people who were much more invested in thinking up terrible stuff.
Yeah, Colson just mentioned his nameless great grandparents. What do you know about your family and its history vis-a-vis your book, and to what extent did that inform the story that you told?
I actually don't know very much about my own family's history. I was born in Ghana, but moved when I was 2 with my immediate family. And so kind of for most of my life, the only family I knew were my parents and my brothers. And yet, I think my family history is in this book in a lot of ways, in that my father is an Ashanti and my mother is a Fanti, and those are the 2 ethnic groups that I focus on in this book. And I think part of that is because of their relationship to slavery, but also part of that is kind of wanting to know a little bit more about what life might have been like, what my ancestors might have been like. I started this book by taking a trip to Ghana in 2009, where I got to kind of, for the first time as an adult, kind of see the world for myself and start to kind of think about some of the things that end up in this book.
So you're going to read a little bit from the book. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the character before you start, and where she falls within the family lines.
Sure. So I'm just going to read from the opening, actually. So Afia is the character's name, and she is the wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which is a slave fort that still stands in Cape Coast, Ghana. And so she kind of grows up in this Fanti village that very soon becomes embroiled in the slave trade. The night Afia Otre was born into the musky heat of Fanti land, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air. It slept in caves and hidden trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached an Ashanti village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kobi Otre, left his first wife, Baba, with the new baby, so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kobi had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baaba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." The villagers began to say that the baby was born of the fire, that this was the reason Baaba had no milk. Afia was nursed by Kobi's second wife, who had just given birth to a son 3 months before. Afia would not latch on, and when she did, her sharp gums would tear at the flesh around the woman's nipples until she became afraid to feed the baby. Because of this, Afia grew thinner, skin on small bird-like bones with a large black hole of a mouth that expelled a hungry cry which could be heard throughout the village even on the days Baaba did her best to smother it, covering the baby's lips with the rough palm of her left hand. "Love her," Kobi commanded, as though love were as simple an act as lifting food up from an iron plate and past one's lips. At night, Baaba dreamed of leaving the baby in the dark forest so that the god Nyame could do with her as he pleased. Afia grew older. The summer after her 3rd birthday, Baaba had her first son. The boy's name was Fifi, and he was so fat that sometimes when Baaba wasn't looking, Afia would roll him along the ground like a ball. The first day that Baaba let Afia hold him, she accidentally dropped him. The baby bounced on his buttocks, landed on his stomach, and looked up at everyone in the room, confused as to whether or not he should cry. He decided against it, but Baaba, who had been stirring benku, lifted her stirring stick and beat Afia across her bare back. Each time the stick lifted off of the girl's body, it would leave behind hot, sticky pieces of benku that burned into her flesh. By the time Baaba had finished, Afia was covered with sores, screaming and crying. From the floor, rolling this way and that on his belly, Fifi looked at Afia with his saucer eyes, but made no noise. Kobi came home to find his other wives attending to Afia's wounds and understood immediately what had happened. He and Baaba fought well into the night. Afia could hear him through the thin walls of the hut where she lay on the floor, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. In her dream, Kobi was a lion and Baaba was a tree. The lion plucked the tree from the ground where it stood and slammed it back down. The tree stretched its branches in protest, and the lion ripped them off one by one. The tree, horizontal, began to cry red ants that traveled down the thin cracks between its bark. The ants pooled on the soft earth around the top of the tree trunk. And so the cycle began. Baaba beat Afia. Kobi beat Baaba. By the time Afia had reached age 10, she could recite a history of the scars on her body. The summer of 1764, when Baaba broke yams across her back. The spring of 1767, when Baaba bashed her left foot with a rock, breaking her big toe so that it now always pointed away from the other toes. For each scar on Afia's body, there was a companion scar on Baaba's, but that didn't stop mother from beating daughter, father from beating mother. Matters were only made worse by Afia's blossoming beauty. When she was 12, her breasts arrived, 2 lumps that sprung from her chest as soft as mango flesh. The men of the village knew that first blood would soon follow, and they waited for the chance to ask Baaba and Kobi for her hand. The gifts started. One man tapped palm wine better than anyone else in the village, but another's fishing nets were never empty. Kobi's family feasted off of Afia's burgeoning womanhood. Their bellies, their hands were never empty. In 1775, Ajwa Adu became the first girl of the village to be proposed to by one of the British soldiers. She was light-skinned and sharp-tongued. In the mornings, after she had bathed, she rubbed shea butter all over her body, underneath her breasts and between her legs. Afia didn't know her well, but she had seen her naked one day when Baba sent her to carry palm oil to the girl's hut. Her skin was slick and shiny, her hair regal. The first time the white man came, Ajua's mother asked Afia's parents to show him around the village while Ajua prepared herself for him. "Can I come?" Afia asked, running after her parents as they walked. She heard Baba's no in one ear and Kobi's yes in the other. Her father's ear won, and soon Afia was standing before the first white man she had ever seen. "He is happy to meet you," the translator said as the white man held his hand out to Afia. She didn't accept it. Instead, she hid behind her father's leg and watched him. He wore a coat that had shiny gold buttons down the middle. It strained against his paunch. His face was red, as though his neck were a stump on fire. He was fat all over and sweating huge droplets from his forehead and above his upper lip. Afia started to think of him as a rain cloud, sallow and wet, shapeless. "Please, he would like to see the village," the translator said, and they all began to walk. They stopped first by Afia's own compound. "This is where we live," Afia told the white man, and he smiled at her dumbly, his green eyes hidden in fog. He didn't understand. Even after his translator spoke to him, he didn't understand. Kobi held Afia's hand as he and Baba led the white man through the compound. "Here, in this village," Kobi said, "each wife has her own hut. This is the hut she shares with her children. When it is her husband's night to go with her, he goes to her in her hut." The white man's eyes grew clearer as the translation was given, and suddenly Afia realized that he was seeing through new eyes, the mud of her hut's walls, the straw of the roof. He could finally see them. They continued on through the village, showing the white man the town square, the small fishing boats formed from hollowed-out tree trunks that the men carried with them when they walked the few miles down to the coast. Afia forced herself to see through new eyes, too. She smelled the sea salt wind as it touched the hairs in her nose, felt the bark of a palm tree as sharp as a scratch, saw the deep, deep red of the clay that was all around them. "Baba," Afia asked, once the men had walked farther ahead of them, "why will Ajua marry this man?" "Because her mother says so." A few weeks later, the white man came back to pay respects to Ajua's mother, and Afia and all of the other villagers gathered around to see what he would offer. There was the bride price of 15 pounds. There were goods he'd brought with him from the castle, carried on the backs of Ashantis. Kobi made Afia stand behind him as they watched the servants come in with fabric, millet, gold, and iron. When they walked back to their compound, Kobi pulled Afia aside, letting his wives and other children walk in front of them. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked her. In the distance, Baba slipped her hand into Fifi's. Afia's brother had just turned 11, but he could already climb up the trunk of a palm tree, using nothing but his bare hands and feet for support. "The white man came to take Ajua away," Afia said. Her father nodded. "The white men live in the Cape Coast Castle. There, they trade goods with our people." "Like iron and millet?" Her father put his hand on her shoulder and kissed the top of her forehead, but when he pulled away, the look in his eyes were troubled and distant. "Yes, we get iron and millet, but we must give them things in return. That man came from Cape Coast to marry Ajua, and there will be more like him who will come and take our daughters away. But you, my own, I have bigger plans for you than to live as a white man's wife. You will marry a man of our village." Baba turned around just then, and Afia caught her eyes. Baba scowled. Afia looked at her father to see if he had noticed, but Kobi did not say a word. Afia knew who her choice for husband would be, and she dearly hoped her parents would choose the same man. Abeku Badu was the next in line to be the village chief. He was tall, with skin like the pit of an avocado, and large hands with long, slender fingers that he waved around like lightning bolts every time he spoke. He had visited their compound 4 times in the last month, and later that week, he and Afia were to share a meal together. stop there.
Yeah, as you skip forward through the different generational lines, it feels like love denied is one of the most powerful forces in your books. So if someone's told they are not allowed to marry that person, they basically go and do exactly that.
Right.
I wonder if you can talk about the sort of chaos factor of love in a sort of economic system of determinism like you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, for Afia's chapter, something that I was thinking about that kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions about people kind of being constrained in these, how do you write about somebody who doesn't have free will, I guess. Afia kind of has this, has the outward appearance of having some will in that she doesn't end up the sister who is kept in the castle as a slave, and yet she's in this system where she's basically married off to whoever her parents please. And so that limited agency, I guess, in terms of who she could love, really impressed me. And then for the rest of the book, because I was writing this multi-generational book, love definitely had to factor in because people needed to have children. But I was thinking a lot, I guess,
about... It doesn't always have to do with that.
They don't always have to have children, but they do in this book. And thinking about the ways that you kind of... that you can keep a family love going, keep a familial love going, even after you've been torn apart. And in some cases, there are characters in this book for whom romantic love is a source of trauma, or, they can't have access to the person that they love. And then familial love can be a source of trauma. And so, yeah, love in kind of all forms was something that was on my mind.
One of the many generations down from Afia is talking to her son, estranged from her, comes back to the village, and she says to him, sometimes you cannot see that the evil in the world begin as the evil in your own home. And one of the things you're writing about, at least on that generation side, on that family side, is the fact that there was not just African, Ghanaian, or whatever, Ashanti complicity in slave trade. It was part of that culture beforehand, and it was only through interactions with Europeans, perhaps in some cases, that it actually became the enterprise that it was. And Colson, this is very different from your book, in which largely the evil is in one side of the house, if you will. There's a quote from, I think, Caesar's thinking. He says, he had met this sort of white man before, earnest and believing what came out of their mouths. The veracity of their words was another matter, but at least they believed them. The southern white man was spat from the loins of the devil, and there was no way to forecast his next evil act. And I wonder if the two of you can talk a tiny bit about just, not necessarily blame, but how you navigate through an economic system which, to call it evil is to sort of extend it from human agency, but it is a human-created system. But how do you describe the terribleness of it without resorting to the capital E evil? Maybe you should take that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the book's about the Underground Railroad. You're dealing with slave masters who obviously have an economic interest and also a philosophical interest in keeping enterprise alive. And then you have whites in the North who are opposed to the peculiar institution and are lending support through money, through passage, trying to get laws changed. And that's the variety of folks engaged in slavery, and that the people who are trying to stop it, people who are trying to perpetuate it. And then I think, just in terms of how I see humanity, people who don't actually really care. There's a character named Ethel in the book whose husband works for the railroad, and she could care less about black freedom, slavery, in the same way that a lot of people aren't up all night thinking about Syria or the homeless problem, 2 miles from their house. There are many people in America in 1850 who just didn't think, didn't care about Africans being enslaved, were just really concerned about getting food on the table and raising their kids and trying to get through the day. And that's the reality of I think folks. And on the plantation, there are slaves who are helpful, slaves who are not helpful to Cora, and that's the variety of human experience on the black side as well. So by changing the terms of the book every 60 pages, I was allowed to have a much bigger cast and many more supporting players who have these different sort of points of view and different folks are evil in different ways, with the capital E and lowercase e.
Yeah, do you want to talk about this? I mean, not just in terms of your book, but maybe in terms of life itself, and just to make this totally awkward. I mean, I can tell sometimes when I've walked in largely black cities and walk around with a goofy smile, and sometimes people smile at you, and people think other people smile and look like, no, your smile does not make you nice. Your smile comes from a long history of smiles that have hidden something else. And reading both of your books reminded me of that and made me realize that I have to do a lot more than fucking smile in some cases. So could you address that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes we have the tendency to believe that we in the present are somehow better, more have more goodness, are smarter than people in the past. We wouldn't have made these same choices, we would never have owned a slave. And for me, part of the challenge of writing this book was thinking about the ways that these characters were just like us. They were people with the same kinds of hopes and dreams and fears and ambitions that we all have, and the same kind of economic incentives. As Colson said, there are things that are happening in our world today, and most of us aren't up in arms about them in a way that's kind of leading to change. And part of my thinking, I guess, was when I went to Ghana. I went to the Cape Coast Castle and I took the tour, and it's the same tour they give to anyone. You can still take it today, and there's nothing really like kind of standing in that dungeon, which still smells even after all of these years. That still has the grime on the walls, and to imagine that this place. It belonged to Ghanaians as well. It wasn't just the British. It was a part of our history as well. And to hear the tour guide kind of talk about the ways that the different ethnic groups were involved in the buying and selling of slaves was something that really deeply affected me because, it kind of just made me remember that humans are fallible in these ways that we can sometimes like to believe that we aren't. And this system was such an intricate system of exploitation, pitting ethnic groups against one another. It was really devastating to kind of think about that, the aspects of my own history that are implicated in this, because I think sometimes, I can't speak for everyone, but I know that sometimes the way that I've heard my own family members talk about slavery is as though it's this thing that belongs to them. It belongs to Americans, it belongs to Black Americans, it's not ours. And yet that huge monument to slavery is on our land. And so we are implicated in it. And so that was kind of the starting point for me.
I wonder, Colson, if you can talk a little bit about how writing this book changed or amplified or recorded to some degree your feelings about the United States as an entity. There's a quote in here which arrested my attention that goes, "In America too is a delusion, the grandest of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there's any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are." There's a meeting afterwards.
I had the idea for the book like 16 years ago, and that sort of conceit about making the Underground Railroad a literal railroad, and then having each state be a different state. And when I had the idea, I knew I wasn't up to the task. And looking back over stuff I used for research, a lot of it is stuff I just read in college and was in the back of my head for a long time. Stuff about eugenics in America, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, because each state has its own sort of scheme for America. For example, in the North Carolina section, it's a white supremacist state, and I'm drawing from obviously racial laws in the South, but also from Oregon, which was founded as a white separatist state. There were obviously problems in abolishing slavery in, say, Louisiana in 1850, when the number of slaves outnumbered the number of white people. They're going to be understandably a little peeved at being tortured and raped for generations. And so some white people just went to the West Coast and were like, we're going to live here and not allow black people. And then I read Harry Jacobs' memoir, Slave Narrative, and she wrote about running from her master and hiding in an attic for 7 years until she could get passes out of North Carolina. And then you think of Anne Frank, and then how can I use the history of racism in America to talk about racism in Nazi Germany and make the conversation about oppression and the demonization of the other into something larger. And so when I thought about a lot of stuff that went into the book, it really is stuff that was in the sort of back of my head for like 30 years and waiting for the right project to be used and sort of step up and find a way into the story.
But do you think that the United States is unbearably tainted from its origins?
Yeah, definitely. I guess people are like, you don't seem to be offering a lot of hope. And I've been thinking about this. I'm like, I'm not really in the hope business. If I wanted to, I would have gone to hope school and learned how to dispense hope. I'm in the art business, the reflection of reality business. And so as someone who's grown less cynical over the years and less pessimistic about systems and the world, someone who wants a nice world for his children, I'm forced to be more optimistic. And definitely if I look at my grandparents, they'd be delighted that their grandson is published by a big house in New York and travels around and people come out to see and read and they'd be proud of my parents. And so obviously things are getting incrementally better, objectively. However, we also have 40% of the voting population in the United States voting for a racist demagogue. And so that sort of takes a little of the shine off of my optimism.
Well, maybe you can maybe you can bring it back just by reading some from the book, because I feel like even though the book is not about hope, the book is so beautifully written. At least it makes you do something better than hope, which is to actually regard something that was hard to look at.
Sure. And also, I think, my last book was about a zombie apocalypse, and the hero is just trying to get to a safe place, a place of refuge, and he has to hope, despite all the evidence, that there is a place that there is a human tribe, that a new family he can join. And of course, if you're running away from the hell of slavery, you do have to have that hope, or else you would never leave. So there is hope in the book. It's frustrated a lot along the way. So in this section, it's Old Jockey's birthday. Old Jockey is the oldest slave on the plantation, and whenever he feels the need for, he senses that things are particularly horrible, he declares that it's his birthday. And it could be once a year or twice a year, and they have a feast and they have music and dancing, so it's Jockey's birthday. There's a reference to Caesar. Caesar was raised on a small family farm in Virginia and was promised that when his owner died, he'd be set free. Of course, his owner's heirs had different plans and sold him and his family and all the furniture and liquidated all the property and sold him down south. And eventually winds up with this very brutal plantation, the Randall plantation. That's very different from his experience before. Randall is run by Terrence and James Randall, two brothers. And there's a reference to Chester, who is also a stray like Cora. He's 10 years old, and Cora has taken him under her wing. The music stopped, the circle broke. Sometimes a slave will be lost in a brief eddy of liberation, in the sway of a sudden reverie among the furrows, or while untangling the mysteries of an early morning dream, in the middle of a song on a warm Sunday night. Then it comes always, the overseer's cry, the call to work, the shadow of the master, the reminder that she's only a human being for a tiny moment across the eternity of her servitude. The Randall brothers had emerged from the great house and were among them. The slaves stepped aside, making calculations of what distance represented the right proportion of fear and respect. Godfrey, James's houseboy, held up a lantern. According to old Jockey, James favored the mother, stout as a barrel and just as firm in countenance, and Terence took after the father, tall and owl-faced, perpetually on the verge of swooping down on prey. In addition to the land, they inherited their father's tailor, who arrived once a month in his rickety carriage with his samples of linen and cotton. The brothers dressed alike when they were children and continued to do so into manhood. Their white trousers and shirts were as clean as the laundry girl's hands could make them, and the orange glow of the lantern made the men look like ghosts emerging from the dark. Master James, Jockey said. His good hand gripped the arm of his chair as if to rise. Master Terence. Don't let us disturb you, Terence said. My brother and I were discussing business and heard the music. I told him, now that is the most god-awful racket I've ever heard. The Randalls were drinking wine out of goblets of cut glass and looked as if they'd drained a few bottles. Cora searched for Caesar's face in the crowd. She did not find him. He hadn't been present the last time the brothers appeared together on the northern half of the plantation. You did well to remember the different lessons of those occasions. Something always happened when the Randalls ventured into the quarter, sooner or later, a new thing coming that you couldn't predict until it was upon you. James left the daily operations to his man Connolly and rarely visited. He might grant a tour to a visitor, a distinguished neighbor or curious planter from another neck of the woods, but it was rare. James rarely addressed his niggers, who'd been taught by the lash to keep working and ignore his presence. When Terence appeared on his brother's half of the plantation, he usually appraised each slave and made note of which men were the most able and which women the most appealing. Content to leer at his brother's women, he grazed heartily upon the women of his own half. I like to taste my plums, Terence said, prowling the rows of cabins to see what struck his fancy. He violated the bonds of affection, sometimes visiting slaves on their wedding night to show the husband the proper way to discharge his marital duty. He tasted his plums and broke the skin and left his mark. It was accepted that James was of a different orientation. To hear his valet Prideful tell it, James confined his erotic energies to specialized room in a New Orleans establishment. The madam was broad-minded and modern, adept in the trajectories of human desire. Prideful's stories were hard to believe, despite assurances that he received his reports from the staff of the place, with whom he'd grown close over the years. After all, what kind of white man would willingly submit to the whip? Terence scratched his cane in the dirt. It had been his father's cane, topped with a silver wolf's head. Many remembered its bite on their flesh. Terence said, Then I recollected James tell me about a nigger he had down here, could recite the Declaration of Independence. I can't bring myself to believe him. I thought perhaps tonight he can show me, since everyone is out and about from the sound of it. James said, We'll settle it. Where is that boy, Michael? No one said anything. Godfrey waved the lantern around pathetically. Moses was the boss unfortunate enough to stand closest to the Randall brothers. He cleared his throat. Michael dead, Master James. Michael, the slave in question, had indeed possessed the ability to recite long passages. According to Connolly, who heard the story from the nigger trader, Michael's former master was fascinated by the abilities of South American parrots and reasoned that if a bird could be taught limericks, a slave might be taught to remember as well. Merely glancing at the size of their skulls told you that a nigger possessed a bigger brain than a bird. Michael had been the son of his master's coachman, had a brand of animal cleverness, the kind you see in pigs sometimes. The master and his unlikely pupil started with simple rhymes and short passages from popular British versifiers. They went slow over the words the nigger didn't understand, and, if truth be told, the master only half understood. But they made miracles, the tobacco farmer and the coachman's son. The Declaration of Independence was their masterpiece. Michael's ability never amounted to more than a parlor trick, delighting visitors before the discussion turned, as it always did, to the diminished faculties of niggers. His owner grew bored and sold the boy south. By the time Michael got to Randall, some punishment or torture had addled his senses. He was a mediocre worker. He complained of noises and black spells that blotted his memory. In exasperation, Connolly beat out what little brains he had left. It was a scourging that Michael was not intended to survive, and it achieved its purpose. James said, "I should have been told," his displeasure plain. Michael's recitation had been a novel diversion the 2 times he trotted the nigger out for his guests. Terence liked to tease his brother. "James," he said, "you need to keep better account of your property. Don't meddle." Terence continued, "I knew you let your slaves have their revels, but I had no idea they were so extravagant. Are you trying to make me look bad?" James's glass was empty. "Don't pretend you care what a nigger thinks about you, Terence." He turned to go. "Oh, one more song, James. These sounds have grown on me." George and Wesley, the musicians, were forlorn. Noble and his tambourine were nowhere to be seen. James pressed his lips into a slit. He gestured, and the men started playing. Terence tapped his cane. His face sank as he took in the crowd. "You're not going to dance? I have to insist. You and you and you." They didn't wait for their master's signal. The slaves of the northern half converged on the alley, haltingly, trying to insinuate themselves into their previous rhythm and put on a show. Putting on a show for a master was a familiar skill, the small angles and advantages of the mask, and they shook off their fear as they settled into the performance. Oh, how they capered and hollered, shouted and hopped. Certainly this was the most lively song they'd ever heard, the musicians the most accomplished players the colored race had to offer. Cora dragged herself into the circle, checking the Randall brothers' reactions on every turn like everyone else. Jockey tumbled his hands in his lap to keep time. Cora found Caesar's face. He stood in the shadow of the kitchen, his expression flat. Then he withdrew. "You!" It was Terence. He held his hand before him as if it were covered in some eternal stain that only he could see. Then Cora caught sight of it, the single drop of red wine staining the cuff of his lovely white shirt. Chester, the boy, had bumped him. Chester simpered and bowed before the white man. Sorry, master. The cane crashed across his shoulder and head again and again. The boy screamed and shrank to the dirt as the blows continued. Terence's arm rose and fell. James looked tired. One drop. A feeling settled over Cora. She'd not been under its spell in years, since she brought the hatchet down on Blake's doghouse and sent the splinters into the air. She'd seen men hung from trees and left for buzzards and crows, women carved open to the bones with the cat o' nine tails, feet cut off to prevent escape, and hands cut off to stop theft. She'd seen boys and girls younger than this beaten and had done nothing. This night, the feeling settled over her heart again. It grabbed hold of her, and before the slave part of her caught up with the human part of her. She was bent over the boy's body as a shield. She held a cane in her hand like a swamp man handling a snake, and saw the ornament at its tip. The silver wolf bared its silver teeth. Then the cane was out of her hand. It came down on her head. It crashed down again, and this time the silver teeth ripped across her eyes, and her blood splattered the dirt.
Colson, that passage recalls to me a passage that occurs in Yaa's book, sort of more towards the end. It takes place in a Harlem nightclub, and one of the characters goes in and sees people in blackface minstrelizing slavery, as if all they did is hang around and sing songs. And in Colson in Underground Railroad, Cora travels onward from this horrible scene and ends up in a museum of the South, and I think it's South Carolina, and it's a sort of burlesquing of what slavery and the system was, and she's inside the case and looking out at all these white faces pressed against the glass, and in both of these instances, it obviously reinforces the fact that the history of slavery and its accounts to many degrees and its costs have been narrated by whites. And I wonder to what degree, Colson, in this book, you try to, as Toni Morrison does in Beloved, reverse the gaze to some degree, or refract it or alter it so that you're not narrating towards the brothers, if you will, but just narrating from your character's experience.
Well, I mean that's my, it's Cora's story, but of course, the language of the narrator is warped by, the perceptions of different characters, sort of tugged by the gravity of their perception. Yaa used the word agency before, and I haven't said agency, more times in my life than since this book came out, because Cora's story is about agency and becoming, moving from property to becoming a human being. And so she goes to South Carolina, and she gets a job in a museum, living dioramas about history. And so over the course of the day, she goes from life in darkest Africa, where she's hanging around in a hut and making simple tools. And then the next window is life on a slave ship, where she's like a sort of cabin boy swabbing the deck in a much different mode of travel. I mean, obviously she would have been down the hold, chained up. And then the last room is life on a plantation, and she's weaving, has a little spinning wheel, and not doing the sort of backbreaking work she did in Georgia. And those are all, arranged by the white curator who's presenting a sanitized version of history. The middle passage was not a brutal meat grinder. The plantation upholds the myth of the happy darky who's sort of lucky to be in bondage. And when she's in these, on the same way that I'm on a stage, she's in this museum window. She's looking back through at the guests, the patrons, and starts to put her own sort of version of history together. She starts to look back. On the plantation, she was always watched by overseers, and her every move watched. And part of her becoming a person and gaining agency is being able to look back upon her oppressors and have a different version. So, I talked about earlier trying to figure out different places where Cora can grow and have her ideas of freedom enlarged and her ideas of herself enlarged. And definitely, that section and other places are hopefully opportunities where the reader gets to sort of join her in that journey.
Do you think this is obviously the content of this book is different than the content of your other 6 novels. But do you think because of the content, this is a different kind of book? Because I feel in John Henry Days, which deals to some degree with mythologizing and race, you respond to meta narratives and the anxiety of telling a narrative in a new context, as you are now, with direct addresses to the reader. So making the fiction less about narrative and the character and more about your direct kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink to the reader to say, look, I know this. You've heard this story before. Let's kind of wrinkle it this way. And I feel in Underground Railroad, rather than make that gesture, you always return back to Cora.
Yeah, no, the book is very different in tone. I think I hit upon a narrative voice that was very useful early on. Usually, I do a lot of outlining and I'm very sort of nerdy that way, but the voice always takes a lot longer. In this case, the voice came quickly, and a lot of the sort of satirical distancing techniques I use in different books didn't seem appropriate here because of just the subject matter and then the execution. And it didn't occur to me to use them. And so I've had books where I'm very digressive and I'm doing this sort of cultural riffing on different things. TV dinners in Sag Harbor. There's like 3 pages on TV dinners. And I think there's a really good 3 pages on TV dinners, being a latchkey kid. But with this book, I got to the museum part and I did it in a page and a half and I was like, I'm done. And I think if I'd written the book when I first thought of it 16 years ago, around the time John Henry Days, the museum thing would have been like 20 pages and I would have gotten really deep into it and how it all works. And I felt, as I was writing the book, a page and a half on this was enough. And I can go on, and Cora is enough to bring us to these different places without me doing some sort of pomo jujitsu on it.
Yeah, do you want to talk about just the not implied or anticipated audience, but just the way that you want to reverse the gaze that your characters are perhaps experiencing in their lives?
Sure. So there's a character in Homegoing named Yao, and he comes kind of later towards the book. And Yao is a teacher. He teaches history to students in Ghana. And he starts every lesson for the new students by going through this history about the scar on his face. And then he ends it by saying to the students, history is storytelling. We believe the ones who have the power. And so in this book, even just in the researching of this book, particularly for the chapters, the earlier chapters, I found it so difficult to find these voices that I wanted so desperately to hear from. I found it very difficult to find any account of the people who worked in the castle, the people who kind of would have been affected by it. And I was working with this one book called The Door of No Return by William St. Clair, which was excellent in that it gave me a great view of just kind of the layout of the castle, what life might have been like for the soldiers, and it kind of set the stage, and yet I felt this absence of Black voices, essentially. And I think that's going back to Yao's point that we believe the ones who have the power. And so this book was very much, I think, an attempt to restore some of that power to a group of people who have not been afforded the opportunity to tell their own stories. So particularly in those earlier chapters, I think thinking about things like folk tales and fables and the ways that you might kind of carry on your story and your history when you don't have access to kind of the written language or these forms that have allowed other voices to persist. I really wanted to kind of pay homage to that and to lend a voice, I guess, to characters who might not have otherwise had one.
His whole quote is, "We believe the one who has the power. He is the one who gets to write the story." So when you study history, you always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so that this voice could come forth? Mm-hmm. And reading your novel, I thought of a book called Ancestor Stones by Aminatou Forna, which grew out of ancestor stones like the one that is passed through your book, that were thrown away before she was able to inherit them. And so in one gesture, her entire family history was thrown away. And so she rewrote it in the form of a novel. And she has all these in-jokes. She's from Sierra Leone, and that are only for people in Sierra Leone. And in your book, there's folk tales and songs which are not translated. And I wonder if, just in some small degree, that's you saying to the reader, this is for the people in the book, and it's okay that you don't understand this, but this is theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I was very much aware of the fact that this book is taking place on two different continents, and so I have these kinds of two different audiences in mind, almost. People who are going to kind of understand and resonate more with the Ghanaian side, and then people who are going to be more attached to the American side. And I wanted to kind of give each side kind of their full weight and their ability to kind of not have to translate their experiences to the other. That felt important.
Colson, one thing that is on the outside of the book and is in every single review, so if you've wandered in and you haven't read either of those things, I'm sorry, but the Underground Railroad in the book is an actual railroad. And I'm sort of curious, at one point, you're sort of the king of metaphors. Every single one of his books revolves around an operating metaphor. The intuitionist about sort of these society of elevator inspectors, John Henry Days about this sort of festival and sort of mythologizing, and Sag Harbor because it's set in a place, and Apex Hides the Hurt about advertising and coding, and this book, The Underground Railroad, as an actual thing, but then as an unbelievable thing. And I wonder at what point in writing this you thought, you know what, I'm going to make it an actual railroad, just trains and all. I'm not even going to explain how it got built.
It was the first day. I mean, so quite early. I was on my couch and then came across a reference to the railroad, Underground Railroad, and remembered being in fourth grade and hearing about it. And the words are so evocative. I imagined a subway, and then my teacher, of course, explained that that's not how it worked. But I thought, what if it actually was a literal railroad? And it was really just that kind of crazy notion, and what kind of story would I get out of it? I think the intuitionist has a metaphor about social uplift, elevators, uplift the race. John Henry Days is about connections in the industrial age, connecting the USA by railroad, and then in the information age, takes place in '96, and comparing that different kind of the different kind of connections. And here, for many years, when I just had the idea for different states, they're going to be separated by, their culture, but also time. And so South Carolina was going to take place in the future, and it was like sci-fi, like sort of Cloud Atlas. And each time you went to a different state, it was a different sort of time zone. And then a few months before I started writing, I was like, well, what if I didn't have those really broad, fantastic gestures and just had it, instead of having magic realism set up to like 11, like a Spinal Tap in 11, I had it sort of turned down to a really mellow 1. And so everything happens in sort of 1850s technology, and I think that sort of deadpan way of dealing with all that sort of fantastic stuff that happens in a book worked. And then in terms of what I was saying before about doing things differently now than I would have done 10 years ago, part of that is turning down to fantasy. And then part of it is not the railroad. 10 years ago, the railroad would have been like, running on a railroad would have been like 10 pages. And here it's really just a door. I want to get cord to the next state. And so the tunnel is really just kind of a door and an entryway, not so much of a overriding metaphor.
Right. So the book is a historical novel, but because as you've been talking, it alters history. It feels like you're doing, through that tiny tonal gesture, what Yaa's talking about in her book, in that you're paying homage to the fact that historical novels are often wrong about history. But you're doing this sort of through fabulism. Is that something you feel, or that you have felt yourself when reading historical novels? Like, it wasn't like that, or this is more of a fantasy than an actual document?
I feel that more about history books, frankly. But I guess that's just me, I guess.
How did you do in your history classes in college?
I didn't learn about the Underground Railroad, definitely. I think, in terms of reckoning with history, since my early decision was to make the Underground Railroad literal, I knew I wasn't going to do a straight historical novel. That's sort of, the tip-off there. But I've had, so many different sort of reckonings with slavery, from seeing Roots when I was like 8, and then studying it in college with my sort of, teenage brain, and then coming to it as, someone in their mid-40s. My idea of what slavery means in terms of American history, what it means in terms of someone who's a father and someone who has a more adult reckoning, as opposed to like my 8-year-old Roots idea of history. I do realize that you're always interpreting it through the lens of who you are at that time, and historians and novelists are always sort of dealing with the past through lens of their own sort of range of associations.
Have you, through this associative, subjective, make-believe rendering of history, touched on actual history? As in, you've been on, you sold an enormous number of copies of this book. It's been a tremendous success. That's the only time I'll quote Donald Trump. Let's keep him out of this entire conversation. He's taken up way too much of our brain space. But it has been an avalanche, this book, and everyone is so happy because everyone has been fans of yours for so long, and finally this book has really taken off. So, have there been readers who have come to you, older readers who knew grandparents who had a connection, or who have responded to this emotionally?
Well, I think it's very difficult material, and when I do a reading, I'll tell some jokes and then read that passage I just read, and there's a bit of whiplash that goes on in the audience because there is such a great tonal shift. I think someone came up to me. It's hard to say. It is very early. Obviously, this is the reception's been much different than to my previous books, and ever since I handed it in to your girlfriend. My agent is John's girlfriend. And I gave to her and my editor, and I worked with them for like 20 years, and just the way they talked about it was like different, and there was like a weird vibration in their voices. And then when I started going to booksellers and different folks, I realized that something about Cora, or the way I was talking about history, was affecting people in a way that people hadn't been affected by my work before. And so it's still a mystery I'm trying to unravel, and I've never felt the way I do about, say, Cora, and compared to my previous characters, and I can still reread like the last final pages and have a really strong reaction to her journey. So I'm also trying to figure out how I feel about the book, and wondering why it's so different than other things I've worked on.
Well, I highly encourage all of you, not just because I'm his girlfriend's boyfriend. If I explained to you how royalties worked, you would understand that there's less in this for me than it might appear. But I can say this: before I started to date her, I'd reviewed 2 of Colson Whitehead's books, and I wouldn't be here if they weren't good reviews, because that was the first thing she did after our first date, was go look through the reviews. And so it's been really exciting to watch. I'm just going to keep shoveling until it's not funny. it's been exciting to watch you build this book, and it's been a huge pleasure of mine to read your book. It is a triumph. It is an epic family story, and I highly, highly encourage all of you to buy her book too. And if you don't have it, you should buy two. So I think they're here now for some questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask of Yaa or Colson? They'd be happy to answer them. The question is, what does Yaa's Ghanaian family think of the book?
I guess first of all, they're just overwhelmingly proud. I kind of had the typical African immigrant experience of them not wanting me to be a writer. And so that was like a huge battle for most of my life. And as a result, maybe of that, I've always been very secretive about my work, and I never showed them anything really. And I didn't show them this book until after I had sold it. So it was kind of up in the air how they might react to it. But it's been really good. And I think, not just because, I'm their family member and they have to love me no matter what. But I think that I think this book has kind of connected some dots for them about kind of their own experiences and I think kind of having come to America and not really having this African-American history on their minds, I think that's kind of opened up some conversations within our family that have been really, really wonderful for me.
Yes, on the corner here. The question is, when Yaa went back to Ghana, did she meet anyone who knew Barack Obama or his family, or maybe just could you talk about Obama as a African American and what his sort of binational roots mean to you as a person returning there?
Weirdly, Obama hasn't called me yet. I don't know what he's doing, but I actually was there the summer that he visited, 2009, and it was astonishing because I think it was the first African country that he went to visit, and we had made songs about him. Every commercial was about him. When I visited the Cape Coast Castle, he had just been there, I think, 2 days before me, and there was a plaque already up dedicated to him and his family, and so he certainly was kind of on my mind as I was traveling around there, just because his presence was kind of looming. But yeah, I mean, I read Dreams from My Father many years ago, and I think I was always struck by that aspect of the book that kind of talks about his identity as the child of an immigrant, his kind of lack of connection, I guess, to Kenya and thinking about Kenya. I don't know if I have much more than that.
You didn't meet him while you were there?
I didn't meet him. I still haven't. Yeah.
Colson's book, The Underground Railroad, was recommended by Obama as a summer read. When he does this summer thing where he goes into the DC bookshop, and that was the book he bought, and then he read it and recommended it. And did he respond to your tweet?
He did not respond to my tweet either. I guess he's busy, too much stuff. I invited him for ribs once he got out of office. So we'll see what happens.
There's a question here. The question is, you've had many different types of books until now, and this book has done so well. Is there pressure from your agent or other people that are near your agent to repeat that book?
Yeah, no, I mean, sometimes your book is well received, sometimes it's not as well received as you'd like, and whether it really takes off and nice things happen or not. When you start writing 6 months or a year later, it's just you and the blank page again, coming up against the limits of your talent and your imagination and trying to make it work. So I don't feel like I have to prove anything. I have two ideas. And one, you were talking about just mixing it up. I don't like to do, my last book was a humor book. This book is definitely not, doesn't have a lot of jokes in it, Underground Railroad. So I have two ideas, and one is sort of overlaps with some of the violence of this book, so I think maybe I shouldn't follow up with that, and I should do something else. And so I definitely need a break from bleak moments in history. In the same way, I needed a break from joking because my last book was a sort of humor book about poker, and so I'll just I'll try to do something that's not too close to what I last did, and it's always going to be terrible because writing is terrible. And then if you just crawl over the glass for a year, you have a book. That's how I like to think about it.
There's a question over here. The question is, have the movie rights to your books been sold?
I have not, no.
There's a guy named Barry Jenkins who has a film coming out called Moonlight. It's doing like circuit, about to come out, I think, in New York this weekend, next week. And he's has permission to take it to get money to make it. So I haven't seen anything, but he has a window where he can convince people to give him money and then give me money. So we'll see. Usually my books have too many black people in them to get made into movies. This definitely does. I'm not sure what'll happen.
Question in the far back.
Isn't that a little irresponsible? Are the stakes that high?
Sure. No, thank you. And I'll repeat it. I guess I wrote a jokey list of 10 tips for writers a couple of years ago from the New York Times, and one of them was, don't be afraid to butch it up once in a while. Rustle up some dysentery. It's worth it for the fever dreams alone. Lose a kidney in a knife fight. You'll be glad you did. So basically a list of all the butch things that I never did, and that probably would have made me enriched my idea of the world. I don't like leaving my house. I like sitting at home, doing my research there. All the stuff I did use for the book was in the public domain, so I can just download it. But for some people, travel is indeed broadening. And and if that works to broaden your emotional and philosophical palette, you definitely should.
There's a question in the center. Yes, standing up.
So my question's for Colson as well. So you mentioned how the Underground Railroad, though to some readers, it acts as a bit of a metaphor, but it's more of a way of opening doors for Cora. Could you talk a little bit more about how making it a physical railroad helped you tell the story differently than if it had been an Underground Railroad?
Sure, thanks. I guess the mic caught most of that, but making the railroad into a literal railroad, and how does that choice allow me to do different things with the book? And again, for me, it was like being, I just kept thinking to myself, keep it simple, stupid. And so whenever I felt I was going to go on a big digression jag, I cut myself back. And then there are different ways of dealing with fantasy and world building. In, say, the Star Trek Next Generation, they're always trying to explain how Data doesn't know anything, even though he's hooked up to like 25th century data banks. And like at this point, Siri and Google are faster than Data. But he'll see someone cry, and he's like, what is that? And, Commander Riker's like, oh, come on, Data, it's like tears. And he's like, buffering, tears, a salty discharge from the eye, signifying happiness or sadness. And it's like, get on with it, Data. And so when I was having fantastic section in this book, I just wanted to skip the whole get on with it Data. I want to get on with it. And except for the last Journey Underground, we don't spend a lot of time in the tunnel. It's really just a way of getting Cora from state to state.
I think there's time for one more question. Yes, standing up.
Hello. Yes, I wanted to ask a question of Yaa. I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of what are some of the things that surprised you in the research when you were doing your research? And in doing that research, how has the book transformed you?
Yeah, I think that really H's chapter, which we talked about earlier, was the most surprising bit of the research for me. I did very much just kind of stumble onto that. I'd had like an entirely different plan for him than to have him end up being a convict through the convict leasing system. And then, stumbling on that article and then going on to read books like Black Prisoners in Their World, and learning about Pratt City, Alabama, which is so close to where I grew up. It just really changed the course of that chapter. So that was the most surprising section. In terms of what I learned while researching, I guess, going back to something that Colson said earlier, people have asked me before if I found the writing of this novel difficult or like too dark at times to kind of get through. But always for me, the research was the most difficult part. Everything that I read, I had to kind of remember, this was happening to real people. These were real people who went through these things. And for every horrible thing that happens in my book, something even more devastating happened to an actual person. And so in that way, I felt a kind of responsibility, I guess, to the people that I was reading about in the research to kind of to write the kind of book that honored them, I guess, in some way.
Yaa has this beautiful concept in the book called forward memory, which is trying to know what you will remember in advance of knowing it. And I truly believe that, years from now, you'll remember having come to this event to see the beginning of one of the most, I think, extraordinary careers to launch in recent memory, and to hear Colson speak about a book which is so obviously a classic from the second it came off the press. It's such a pleasure to share the stage with them tonight. They're going to be signing books. It is back that over in this corner. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. Colson Whitehead and Yaa Gyasi.
You've been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one, please visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.